Anyone who lives in Lahnstein, a town a few kilometers from Koblenz, is familiar with the Rittersturz's barracks. However, this federal military property bore a different name until less than a year ago, in November 2022, Dein Bruchmüller Barracks. It had been named after the Prussian general of artillery Gustav Adolf von Dynäs, born in Hanau in 1852 and deceased in 1914, the creator of German heavy artillery. And after the general of artillery Georg Bruchmüller, born in Berlin in 1863 and deceased in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in 1948. But these two completely unburdened and deserving officers also fell victim to the consistent eradication of old traditional names pursued by the political military leadership of the Bundeswehr. As in most such cases, and against the resistance of the local population, the old barracks name was abolished and replaced with the new, meaningless designation Rittersturz's Barracks. To achieve this, the Christian Democratic Union Member of Parliament from Koblenz also had to exert himself considerably with his approval. In principle, the goal of renaming the barracks is understandable. Artillery officer Georg Bruchmüller, due to his past in the First World War, does not stand for a modern Bundeswehr and the democratic values of the Federal Republic. This justification by the Christian Democratic Union politician is far-fetched, to put it very politely. For if General Bruchmüller appears unworthy as a namesake because of his so-called, quote, past in the First World War, how should we then judge the protagonists who served as officers in the Second World War? Here is a selection of 3 ministers of defense and 1 federal president. Christian Democratic Union, Lieutenant in the Abwehr of Army Group, High Command of the Wehrmacht under Admiral Canaris, Kai-Uwe von Hassel. Christian Social Union, Army Anti-Aircraft, First Lieutenant Franz Josef Strauss. Free Democratic Party, Luftwaffe, Night Fighter, First Lieutenant Walter Scheel. Social Democratic Party, Luftwaffe, Anti-Aircraft, First Lieutenant Helmut Schmidt, or General Steinhoff, after whom an entire wing was even named. Following the logic of those responsible for the renamings, it would not be surprising if, out of sheer boredom, they someday also set their sights on eliminating the names just mentioned. Added to the Lahnstein farce is the fact that the Hotel Rittersturz, demolished in 1974, where a parliamentary conference on the possible founding of the West German state took place in 1948, and after which the barracks was named, had nothing to do with Lahnstein, but rather with neighboring Koblenz. What is surprising about the renaming with regard to General Bruchmüller is that this general of the First World War was allegedly considered the inventor of modern and systematic artillery fire, and, under the nickname Breakthrough Müller, for decades the guru of German artillery. But with regard to his invention of systematic fire and the recognition he received for it, he also owed this to his books, in which he praised himself as the inventor, even though this did not correspond to the truth. In any case, in 1914, at the age of 51, he was reactivated and deployed on the Eastern Front. There he recognized the frequent uselessness of the mindless employment of artillery prior to offensives, the days or weeks-long bombardments with so-called drum fire intended to annihilate the enemy. This, however, resulted, besides the loss of surprise, massive ammunition consumption, and heavy wear on the guns, merely in turning the attack terrain into a muddy and ruined landscape scarcely passable for man or beast. Bruchmüller then determined which type of artillery should be employed against which targets. Enemy artillery and assembled reserves were to be engaged by long-range artillery, infantry support artillery, and the heaviest direct fire, while heavy and light direct fire was suitable for bombarding the forward lines. If all types of fire were combined, according to the inventor, this would result in the so-called creeping barrage, in which a broad section of the front was shelled by artillery for a few minutes, before the barrage was shifted approximately 100 meters forward, allowing the infantry following closely behind the barrage to advance into the previously shelled sector. He allegedly applied this new method for the first time with great success in March 1916, during the Battle of Lake Narach in Belarus. There, too, artillery and infantry assault units had depended on close cooperation. And in order to engage resistance nests with direct fire, he assigned battlefield artillery to the infantry, such as the light 7.58 centimeter trench mortar, originally assigned to engineers and transported by crew, as well as light accompanying guns, like the Austrian 7.5 centimeter mountain gun model 15. Finally, a tactical variant was developed jointly with the infantry, according to which specially trained and equipped assault troops of the regiments were to bypass enemy resistance nests and instead concentrate on the breakthrough, while the following companies were to handle their suppression and capture. In the Battle of Karfreid in 1917, the 12th Battle of the Isonzo, which this video covers, this method was employed with complete success, and here as well as in March 18 during the Great Battle in France, a double creeping barrage with devastating consequences for the enemy was fired. The first consisted of 70% gas shells and 30% high explosive shells, the second solely of high explosive shells. But, as I have already mentioned, in 1916, Bruchmüller was by no means the inventor of this method that transformed the outdated use of artillery at the beginning of the war in the age of mobile and increasingly mechanized mass armies. Instead, Bruchmüller had adopted much of it from an experience and combat report already compiled by someone else in the autumn of 1916. Chance also played a role, for when the new procedures were conceived, planned, and executed in 1914, an artillery quantum leap in tactical terms, it was possible because chance brought the right people together at the right time, and the mission itself was suitable. This occurred in the first phase of the First World War, in a battle so insignificant to military historians that it is hardly mentioned anywhere. Yet the Battle of Vailly on the 30th of October, 1914, anticipated exactly what the eloquent self-promoter Bruchmüller later claimed for himself, without diminishing his later achievements. A brief retrospective is necessary. Beginning on the 18th of August, 1914, as the general advance of the German army against France began, the First German Army under Colonel General Alexander von Kluck stood on the extreme northern right wing, according to the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan, an offensive advance plan against France, had been devised in 1905 by the Chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Alfred Count von Schlieffen. Simplified, it envisaged that 5 German armies, the 1st through 5th, with more than 1 million soldiers in active formations, would advance north of the French Cambrai-Meuse front, and then, executing a great leftward wheel, gain a continuous front. This front would touch Paris in the west and extend eastward into the Argonne southwest of Verdun, thereby annihilating the French army in a massive encirclement battle. This was precisely what the Carthaginian Hannibal had done in the Second Punic War on the 2nd of August 216 before Christ at Cannae in southeastern Italy against the 16 legions of the Roman consuls Paulus and Varro. A particularly important point for Schlieffen was strengthening the right wing of the sickle with which the wheeling maneuver was to be executed, forming a continuous front between Paris in the west and the Argonne in the east, where he hoped to strike and defeat the bulk of the Franco-British army. And indeed, the strongest fighting force, the First Army, had advanced with enormous marching efforts through the left flank of the French army and pushed back the British Expeditionary Force. On the 3rd of September, a Ulan patrol had advanced to within just a few kilometers of Paris. But then something unforeseen occurred. due to the absence of a sufficient reserve army behind the right wing, which Schlieffen is said to have strongly demanded during a regrouping of the German front, a gap 40 kilometers wide opened up between Kluck's First Army and the Second Army under Colonel General Karl von Bülow, which could not be closed due to the lack of reserves. When Anglo-French forces pushed into this gap, leading to the Battle of the Marne from the 5th to the 12th of September, the chief of the Great General Staff, Colonel General Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, who was on the verge of collapse, did not personally assess the decisive situation, but instead sent an emissary to the front on the 9th of September. This was the head of the intelligence section at the General Staff of the Field Army, the Royal Saxon Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch, who had been promoted to lieutenant colonel only a few months earlier. Hensch assessed the situation as extremely bleak and, based on a verbal instruction from the Supreme Army Command, also considered himself authorized to independently order the retreat of the Second Army. This then prompted the Army General Staff, headquartered in Luxembourg and from October known as the Supreme Army Command, to completely abort the Battle of the Marne, halt the advance, and withdraw the German armies by approximately 80 kilometers by the 12th of September, back behind the River Aisne. With this, the Schlieffen Plan had failed, and the German Western Army was forced to transition from a war of movement into trench warfare for years to come. One of the principal mistakes of the nervously fragile Colonel General Moltke had been that he remained far too distant from events with the army leadership in Luxembourg. As a result, the leadership was unable to act immediately and, for example, to compensate for command deficiencies of individual commanders through clear orders. Moltke was relieved of his post immediately after the Battle of the Marne on the 14th of September and replaced by the former Prussian Minister of War, Lieutenant General Erich von Falkenhayn. 2 months later, on the 18th of November, Falkenhayn stated to Imperial Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg that due to the debacle at the Marne and at Ypres, and in view of the enemy's resources, the war was lost for Germany, and that he therefore advocated a negotiated peace, which Bethmann-Hollweg, however, rejected. As for Hensch, one of Moltke's closest advisors, although he had to vacate his former post, he was promoted to colonel in 1916, and a year later appointed Chief of Staff of the Military Administration in occupied Romania. For his services there, he was awarded the Pour le Mérite in September 17, but already died of illness in February 18 in Bucharest at the age of 49. After the retreat of the German armies, which the French called the Miracle of the Marne, the German divisions took up defensive positions in the north along the River Aisne, which in many places was up to 100 meters wide. From the heights, they could observe both the trench systems of the British and French regiments and parts of the hinterland. However, during the Battle of the Aisne, which lasted from the 12th to the 20th of September, the British, shown in red, and the French, shown in light green, succeeded in establishing larger bridgeheads on the north side of the river, which included the village shown in yellow. In the course of the following months, the German front, shown in green, moved closer to the river, but the green-red bulge around the village remained, and thus constituted a constant threat to the German positions. In order to eliminate this threat, von Kluck ordered the 3rd Army Corps, shown in yellow, with the 2 divisions shown in green, to carry out an attack with limited objectives on the 30th of October. The commander of the 3rd Corps was General of Infantry Ewald von Lochow. For the mission, he designated the 5th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Georg Wichura, recruited from Frankfurt and der Oder, and the 6th Infantry Division under Major General Richard Herwarth von Bittenfeld, recruited from Brandenburg an der Havel. The objective of the operation by the 2 divisions, which were to be supported by heavy corps artillery, was to drive the French back across the Aisne, shown in blue, and to capture the heights around the village of Vailly-sur-Aisne. Their opponent in the south was the French 69th Infantry Division under General Nero. For the attack, the 5th Infantry Division was assigned the 3rd Battalion of the Leib Grenadier Regiment King Friedrich Wilhelm III, number 8, and the 2nd Battalion of Infantry Regiment von Stülpnagel, number 48, both from the 9th Infantry Brigade, as well as the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the Grenadier Regiment Prince Karl of Prussia, number 12, and the 3rd Battalion of Infantry Regiment von Alvensleben, number 52, from the 10th Infantry Brigade, from the 11th Infantry Brigade of the 6th Infantry Division, the 3rd Battalion of Infantry Regiment Count Tauentzian of Wittenberg, number 20, the 3rd Battalions of Infantry Regiment Grand Duke Friedrich Franz II of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, number 24, in Niosistar-Bauer, and the 3 battalions of Infantry Regiment Field Marshal Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia, number 64, from the 12th Infantry Brigade. On the night of the 30th of October 1914, the German attack began with a heavy artillery bombardment of both the French positions and the rear areas. Then, at 8:30, the infantry battalions advanced. Within 7 hours, they had fulfilled all objectives and simultaneously captured 2,000 prisoners. Orange shows the original front line. Light green, the line reached after 7 hours, beyond the river, shown in blue. This very locally limited tactical success would not be worth mentioning among the many other major engagements on the Western Front during these weeks, if it had not been of significance for the future employment of both the involved command personnel and the combined use of infantry and artillery throughout the entire army. For in stark contrast to the failed, costly operations of the Fourth Army, under Colonel General Albrecht, Duke of Württemberg, during the First Battle of Flanders from the 20th of October to the 18th of November 1914, in which poorly trained and equipped German reserve regiments had attacked into French machine gun fire at Langemarck, or when the Sixth Army under Colonel General Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria failed to capture the city of Ypres. Kluck's First Army had accomplished all combat objectives in the Battle of Vailly within a few hours, at a cost of 3,500 men killed or wounded. But how had this rapid success of the Third Army Corps under General of Infantry Ewald von Lochow been made possible, to which the First Army under Colonel General Alexander von Kluck, shown here with his staff, had issued the order? Well, it was due to several favorable combinations whose effects can only be observed in war, provided that know-it-all, meddling superiors, bloated regulations, or directives detached from the front do not prevent innovative operational planning from the outset. And as I already mentioned earlier, it was both the combination of officers responsible for the attack, who would later in their lives attain significant positions, and the content of the mission itself. The Chief of Staff of the Third Army Corps was then Lieutenant Colonel Hans von Ziegt, who after the war, from 1920 to 1926, served as Chief of the Army Command of the Reichswehr. In 1914, he played a key role in planning the Battle of Vailly-sur-Aisne. Indeed, his performance in this battle, and later in the Third Army Corps' battle around Soissons in January 15, led to his appointment as Chief of Staff of the newly formed 11th Army. Here he is seen with the commander of the 11th Army, General of Cavalry August von Mackensen, and Emperor Wilhelm II. Ziegt had been responsible for the planning and execution of the Battle of Vailly. Thus, he had at his side, in the person of the first General Staff Officer of the Third Army Corps, Major Georg Wetzel, an exceptionally gifted officer who had first been an engineer, then an artillery officer, and later an infantry officer, before being assigned to the Great General Staff after attending the War Academy in 1903. Decorated with the Oak Leaves to the Pour le Mérite, Wetzel enjoyed a remarkable career over the course of the war. In August 16, he became the right-hand man of General Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and Colonel General Erich Ludendorff in the 3rd Supreme Army Command. Ultimately, he served as Chief of Staff of the Fifth Army. He was discharged from the Reichswehr in 1927 with the honorary rank of General of Infantry, having also served there in positions of responsibility. For the employment of the substantial artillery forces, Zeigt had at his disposal one of the finest artillery officers of the German army in the person of the artillery advisor to the First Army, Colonel Richard von Berendt. Later, in the summer of 15, Berendt, also awarded the Oak Leaves to the Pour le Mérite, became artillery advisor to Army Group Gallwitz, named after General of Artillery Max von Gallwitz, which in August received the designation 12th Army. He was co-responsible for the strategically decisive German victory over the Russian army in the breakthrough Battle of Gorlice Tarnów. In the final half year of the war, Berendt commanded the 29th Infantry Division. In the Reichswehr, he later commanded, among other units, the 3rd Division and group commands, until he was retired at the end of 1924 as a general of artillery. However, during the First World War, particularly in the Battle of Vailly, the employment of his artillery yielded important insights for combat in trench warfare. On this basis, the staff of the First Army compiled an experience in combat report that outlined consequences for the new form of warfare on the Western Front. This experience report was so precise and convincing that it was soon distributed throughout the entire army, and thus was likely also read by General of Artillery Bruchmüller. The greater part of the experience and combat report dealt with the employment of artillery. Thus, for the first time in the Battle of Vailly, an artillery advisor at army level, Lieutenant Colonel Berendt, was deployed to coordinate field artillery and heavy artillery. He also described in detail which artillery pieces were assigned to which targets and what effects they achieved. For example, the employment of field guns up to 9 centimeters and light field howitzers up to 10.5 centimeters against distant targets in enfilade had proven effective. Derived from the French en file, meaning in line, a method practiced by musketeers since the end of the 16th century. In this method, soldiers from the front line would move around the formation after firing in order to rejoin it for reloading. This ensured a regular rate of fire by multiple ranks. Against enemy field fortifications, the experience report recommended heavy field howitzers of the Corps Artillery and 21-centimeter mortars. By contrast, field guns had proven to be of only limited utility in trench warfare. To ensure optimal cooperation between field and heavy artillery, the senior artillery commander was to inspect the positions of the various batteries and thereby ensure that each gun was employed optimally. His function as Army Artillery Commander had also allowed him during the battle to concentrate the fire of a large number of batteries of different calibers. Berendt was able to substantiate his explanations precisely because he himself had supervised the different artillery formations during the battle. This was a procedure at army level that had not previously been practiced in the First World War. Another groundbreaking innovation in this battle was the designation of artillery targets using aerial reconnaissance photographs. For the first time in the war, aircraft were employed by the First Army for reconnaissance to photograph enemy positions and artillery. After returning and developing the photographs, artillery officers transferred the results onto situation maps in order to calculate precise positions and distances. It is true that the British Army had also employed aircraft for artillery reconnaissance early on. However, they had not yet taken photographs, but instead, for example, flew 2 loops over a German artillery position or troop concentration, which would then be shelled by British artillery. And it was not General Bruchmüller who first fired creeping barrages in 1916, but rather the Corps Artillery of the First Army as early as 1914. For this purpose, Lieutenant Colonel Berendt had concentrated artillery fire in 5 phases during the night of the 30th of October, and again in the early morning. During the individual pauses in fire, reconnaissance patrols with artillery participation advanced to assess destruction and, if necessary, adjust the artillery fire. To keep the enemy uncertain about German intentions, each creeping barrage lasted for a different length of time, between 30 and 90 minutes. The fifth and final barrage was particularly intense, intended to paralyze French trench garrisons before the German infantry attack. In addition, Lieutenant Colonel Barracks developed what was known as box barrage fire. Here is a British artillery map from 1917 and an early form of the creeping barrage as well as moving barrage fire. All of this, which Colonel Bruchmüller later claimed to have invented. When the infantry regiments of the two German divisions, 5 and 6, advanced after the 5 creeping barrages, the continuing fire of their own artillery shifted forward in front of the infantry to previously designated points that had been marked on the infantry maps. This fire sealed off sections of the battlefield, preventing or at least hindering the approach of French reserves, a welcome safeguard against surprises from the flanks. In the estate of General von Seeckt, there is a study by a major named Arthur Bullrich from 1914 entitled The Battle of Vailly on the 30th of October, 1914, as the starting point for the successes at Gorlice, Decisive New Tactical Principles. In it, Bullrich clearly states that creeping barrages, rolling barrage fire, and box barrages all originated from the planning of the Battle of Vailly. Finally, the experience and combat report of the First Army from October 1914, prepared by infantry and artillery officers, emphasized the necessity of careful planning before every attack in trench warfare, thus moving away from the carefree bayonet and hurrah charge straight into French machine gun fire. Another key demand lay in the importance of close cooperation between infantry and artillery before and during every attack, as well as in the absolute necessity of setting realistic objectives. Thus, the Battle of Vailly-sur-Aisne was likely displaced in history books by other, larger engagements. But the now forgotten success of the Third Army Corps henceforth benefited the entire German army.